In 1974, an 8-year-old boy named Chris Carrier was abducted in South Florida and taken into the swamps of the Everglades. There he was stabbed repeatedly in the chest and abdomen with an ice pick before being shot through the head with a handgun. Remarkably though, Carrier didn't die from this ordeal. He woke up hours later with a severe headache and blind in one eye. He stumbled to the highway to wave down a car which took him to hospital, and he made a recovery. 22 years later, a local police officer informed Carrier that his suspected attacker, one David McAllister, now a frail 77-year-old, was lying in a North Miami Beach nursing home, close to death. The officer suggested that Carrier confront him and get satisfaction. It would be his last chance to do so. Now, history records that Chris Carrier did indeed go to visit the old man in hospital, but it wasn't for confrontation, as the police officer had suggested. It was for something else altogether far more astonishing. It was to forgive him. You see, Chris Carrier had become a Christian aged 13. Later he served as a youth pastor, and in those last days of McAllister's life, Carrier actually befriended him. Local newspaper reports say that Chris began visiting McAllister regularly and often read the Bible and prayed with him. Through these visits, Carrier eventually led McAllister to the Lord. The New York Times reported on the last moments they spent together, saying that Carrier took along a pound of the friend's favourite fish treat, smoked amberjack, comforted the man and made sure that he was warm and well taken care of. It was the last time that he saw his friend, who died later that night. Now, one might well ask how Carrier could forgive and even befriend the man who tried to brutally murder him as an innocent child. And surely no one would have blamed him if he'd held a grudge against his attacker all those 22 years. And yet there's something so compelling about the fact that he didn't. There's something extraordinary about the fact that he chose to forgive. If you dig around, you'll find many stories like these. There's Anthony Collin, who befriended his brother's murderer. Anger festered with Anthony for 14 years, but after becoming a Christian, he decided to forgive and reach out to the man, one Michael Rowe. They became friends thereafter. There's police officer Stephen McDonald, who was shot 3 times and paralysed from the neck down by drug dealers in New York Central Park. He befriended his attacker in jail, saying, "I forgave the shooter because I believe the only thing worse than receiving a bullet in my spine would have been to nurture revenge in my heart."
Forgiveness is a beautiful expression of love. It's the best kind of love. It's the kind of love that God has spoken about, is speaking about, and it can change the world.
You'll find many stories like these, and they're always extraordinary. And the reason they're so extraordinary is because these people had legitimate reason to hate and feel bitter and hold on to a grudge. They were innocent victims permanently scarred by the evil actions of another person, and yet they forgave. That is extraordinary. C.S. Lewis once wrote that everyone thinks that forgiveness is a lovely idea until he has something to forgive. That's absolutely true. We read these stories of forgiveness and find them inspiring and emotionally uplifting, but when we personally have been hurt and have a right to feel bitter, choosing to let go instead and forgive is absolutely tortuous. It's the most difficult thing in the world. And why should we forgive at all? Carrier, Collin, McDonald would have had every right to hold a grudge against their attackers. Why should innocent victims forgive people who have perpetrated such evil against them? Well, there are 2 reasons that forgiveness should be absolutely integral to our lives. But before we get into those 2 reasons, let's firstly define what forgiveness really means. Timothy Keller gave some beautiful insight into forgiveness in his book, The Reason for God. I'm going to read a lengthy passage here, which admittedly doesn't make for great video, but it's vital that we understand this mechanism, and he describes it so well. So let's get into it. Keller says, "Let's begin with a purely economic example. Imagine that someone borrows your car, and as he backs it out of the driveway, he strikes a gate, knocking it down along with part of a wall. Your property insurance doesn't cover the gate and garden wall. So what can you do? There are essentially 2 options. The first is to demand that he pay for the damages. The second is to refuse to let him pay anything and you pay it yourself. There may also be a middle of the road solution in which you both share the cost of the payment. Notice that in every option, the cost of the damage must be borne by someone. Either you or he absorbs the cost for the deed, but the debt does not somehow vanish into thin air. Forgiveness in this illustration means bearing the cost for his misdeed yourself. So the idea is that wrongdoings create a debt that has to be paid either by the perpetrator themselves or by yourself. Now Keller continues, most of the wrongs done to us cannot be assessed in purely economic terms. Someone may have robbed you of some happiness, reputation, opportunity, or certain aspects of your freedom. So think of Carrier losing the ability to see in one eye, or think of Colin losing his brother, or MacDonald losing the ability to walk. No price tag can be put on such things, yet we still have a sense of violated justice that does not go away when the other person says, I'm really sorry. When we are seriously wronged, we have an indelible sense that the perpetrators have incurred a debt that must be dealt with. Once you have been wronged and realize there is a just debt that can't simply be dismissed, there are only two things to do. The first option is to seek ways to make the perpetrators suffer for what they have done to you. You can withhold relationship and actively initiate or passively wish for some kind of pain in their lives, commensurate to what you've experienced. There are many ways to do this. You can viciously confront them, saying things that hurt. You can go around to others to tarnish their reputation. If the perpetrators suffer, you may begin to feel a certain satisfaction, feeling they are now paying off their debt. There are some serious problems with this option, however. You may become harder and colder, more self-pitying, and therefore more self-absorbed. If the wrongdoer was a person of wealth or authority, you may instinctively dislike and resist that sort of person for the rest of your life. If it was a person of the opposite sex or another race, you might become permanently cynical and prejudiced against whole classes of people. In addition, the perpetrator and his friends and family often feel that they have the right to respond to your payback in kind, so cycles of reaction and retaliation can go on for years. Evil has been done to you, yes, but when you try to get payment through revenge, the evil does not disappear. Instead, it spreads, and it spreads most tragically of all into you and your own character. There is another option, however. You can forgive. Forgiveness means refusing to make them pay for what they did. However, to refrain from lashing out at someone when you want to do so with all your being is agony. It's a form of suffering. You not only suffer the original loss of happiness, reputation, and opportunity, but now you forgo the consolation of inflicting the same upon them. You are absorbing the debt, taking the cost of it completely upon yourself instead of taking it out on the other person. It hurts terribly. Many people would say it feels like a kind of death. So when a wrongdoing is committed, it always creates a debt. Therefore, when a wrongdoing is perpetrated against us, we have two options. Either we make that person pay their own debt, we make them pay for what they did, or we absorb the debt upon ourselves and we forgive them, we let them go. Those are the only two options, but either way, one of us has to pay it. The debt never simply disappears into thin air. Now, Keller notes that making the perpetrator pay for their own debt seems the instinctive and satisfying thing to do. We might even say to them, I'm gonna make you pay for what you did. However, if we become embittered and bear a grudge and try to make them pay, we embrace victimhood, self-absorption, prejudice, bitterness, and cycles of retaliation will likely ensue. In this way, evil multiplies in the world, but worst of all, it begins to multiply within us. Holding unforgiveness and bitterness in your heart may actually do more damage to you in the long run than the initial injury itself. Remember, that's what MacDonald said. He said, the only thing worse than the bullet would be to nurture revenge in his heart. And science gives us clear evidence of this. Science tells us that holding on to unforgiveness is hugely self-destructive. And indeed, that's the first of the two reasons why we should try to make forgiveness integral to our lives. In a recent study at Hope College, test subjects were asked to practice unforgiveness by fixating on someone who had hurt, mistreated, or offended them. While they were ruminating in their minds on this enemy, their bodies were monitored for physiological changes, and it was discovered their blood pressure, their heart rate, their facial muscle tension, and sweat gland activity all began rising. Afterwards, they all reported feeling more angry, sad, anxious, and in less control too. Things were then switched around, and the test subjects were asked to try empathizing and forgiving the people they had previously been thinking about instead. Again, they were monitored while doing this, and all of the harmful physical reactions started coasting downwards. The stress markers completely disappeared, and they reported feeling happier, more relaxed, and more content. Another team at UC Berkeley did a similar experiment on 39 subjects while measuring cortisol levels in the body. Now, cortisol is a hormone that is produced in response to stress, and that can put our cardiovascular system under strain, leading to heart attacks, strokes, and other ailments. The experiment revealed that cortisol levels shoot up in people who are holding on to self-confessed unforgiveness, thus raising their chance of heart disease and early death. A third team at Luther College in Iowa conducted a survey of 1,500 people, asking to what degree they practiced forgiveness. They were then asked to report on their physical and mental health, and the team discovered that those who were practicing forgiveness had better life satisfaction, especially as they got older, and were reporting less psychological distress like anxiety, nervousness, restlessness, and depression. If we put all of these experiments together, and there are many more besides these, we can see that unforgiveness promotes anxiety, depression, anger. It heightens the chance of cardiovascular disease and early death through heart attacks and strokes. Hormonal changes damage the immune response and leave us more open to infections and disease too. And perhaps now the old adage begins to make sense, that to forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover the prisoner was you. The bottom line is that if we want health and happiness, we have to learn to absorb the debts perpetrated against us, forgive, and let go. It's for our own good. Indeed, it's been said another way that holding on to unforgiveness is like holding on to a burning hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You're the one getting burned. Nelson Mandela once said it was like drinking poison and expecting the other man to die. Unforgiveness hurts ourselves far more than the one we're holding a grudge against. Therefore, we need to learn to let it go. And we need to learn this lesson quickly. We live in a world that is full of sinful, fallen human beings. We're one of them. Therefore, it's absolutely inevitable that we will hurt and be hurt by the people around us. We simply can't avoid that. It's just a part of life's journey that we will all experience. People hurt each other. And when people hurt us, when people create that debt against us, as they inevitably will, we need to make a conscious decision about how we will react to those debts. If we choose to be embittered and hostile, to embrace victimhood and to hold grudges, to try to pay them back in kind, it will be self-destructive. It will produce anxiety, depression, it will damage our health and multiply evil in the world. If, on the other hand, we can, through gritted teeth, absorb that debt, empathize, forgive, let go, we will be free. If we hold on to unforgiveness, we become the prisoner. Forgiving, as painful as that is the only way to find contentment, peace, and happiness in life, and to guard our health too. That's the choice in front of us. I'm more convinced with every passing day that the world needs to hear this message like never before. We live in a world that is raging at each other. We live in a culture that encourages victimhood. And I actually want to make a separate video about that soon. But embracing victimhood by necessity requires holding grudges. And so the world is filled with grudges and bitterness, retaliation, anxiety, depression, and all the rest. The world can only begin to heal and people can only begin to set themselves free when they learn to forgive, as painful as that may be. You may have been hurt, you may have every right to feel bitter. But like Carrier, Colin, and MacDonald, we need to learn forgiveness. Otherwise, the evil will multiply in the world, and most tragically of all, the evil will multiply in ourselves. Learning forgiveness will save our personal relationships too. A team of scientists at the University of Buffalo recently did an interesting study on the role of forgiveness within marriages. They discovered that when a couple are new to each other and haven't had the chance to let each other down or inflict hurt yet, they are full of undying love. They profess a willingness to do anything for each other and they work hard to cooperate towards common goals. I guess this could be described as the honeymoon phase in the relationship. At some point, however, one of the partners will inevitably commit a transgression that hurts the other. It will happen. And the Buffalo team have noted that when that day comes, it tends to signal a noticeable change in the nature of the relationship. Suddenly there's an awareness that a debt is being created. So the victim starts focusing on making the other person pay. They start trying to get even, they start keeping score. Rather than cooperating, they become competitive. Suddenly they're keen not to lose arguments and they try to battle for the moral upper hand. They use past transgressions and arguments to remind their partner of their outstanding debt. And this, the team has discovered, is the moment when relationships can begin to unravel. A cycle of reaction and retaliation begins to set in, while victimhood, self-absorption, prejudice, and bitterness begins to creep into each partner's soul. Scientists have concluded, therefore, that forgiveness is one of, if not the, most essential ingredient in a long-lasting, happy relationship. I mean, given the inevitability of hurting each other, that will happen. We need to learn to absorb the debts of the other, or our relationships will fall apart. Now, that's not to say that we all need to become doormats either. If marriage partners have problems with each other, it is better to air them in a full and frank discussion. In fact, it's actually vital that we don't suppress our hurts and concerns. They'll only fester. We need to talk it out. But once all is said and done, the end goal must always be to reach a point where we can absorb and forgive the faults of the other. UC Berkeley says forgiveness helps restore more benevolent and cooperative goals to relationships. So forgiveness is the glue that holds sinful people together. It is vital for good relationships and for any kind of contentment, peace, health, and happiness in this life. And science is proving this now. But it's at this point we need to say that the Bible has been telling us to practice forgiveness for thousands and thousands of years. In Colossians we read, "Make allowance for each other's faults and forgive anyone who offends you. Remember, the Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others." In Ephesians we read, "Get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, harsh words and slander, as well as all types of evil behavior. Instead, be kind to each other, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as God through Christ has forgiven you." At the start of this episode, I asked the question, why should we forgive anyone at all? Someone causes me pain, they deserve payback. Why should I forgive them? Well, the first reason that we've been focusing on until now is that it will make us happier and healthier if we do. Holding on to unforgiveness is self-destructive. That's point number one. However, the second reason that we should forgive others, as Christians anyway, has just been revealed in those last two verses. We should forgive others because God has first forgiven us. And that's really the core of the Christian gospel. You see, every one of us has sinned. Every one of us has done wrong. Therefore, every one of us has created a debt between ourselves and God, the creator of this universe. We have sinned against Him, therefore we've created a debt against Him. Now, God, in His kindness, in His goodness, paid that debt that we deserve when He died on the cross for our sins. It was incredibly painful for Him to do that, to absorb our debt. It was excruciating, but Jesus willingly paid it on our behalf, shouting as He died, "Father, forgive them." That's the reason He came, to pay our debt so we could be forgiven. Now, if you're not a Christian, you're left with a straight choice here. Since your wrongdoing before God has created that debt, will you pay the debt yourself and die? Or will you accept Jesus' payment on your behalf, be forgiven, and walk free? Those are your two options. Either you pay the debt of death or you let Jesus take that debt for you. But one of you has to. The debt doesn't simply vanish into thin air. It never does. Now, Christians are simply those who have accepted the forgiveness of God through the death of His Son Jesus. He paid our debt so that we can be forgiven and go free. It's that simple. It was an undeserved act of grace, and for that reason, none of us can boast about our forgiveness, about our eternal life, as though we had anything to do with it. We didn't. We're just forgiven because Jesus paid our debt and we accepted. We said yes. Now, you can be too, but you must make that decision. And then going forward, if we do accept God's forgiveness for all the sins that we've committed, remember that we must then forgive others too, for whatever they do to us. So God has forgiven us of so much, therefore we must forgive others of just as much. And that is reason number two why we should forgive, because God has first forgiven us. I'm going to leave this parable here. I'm not going to read it out because this episode is getting quite long now, but you can press pause and read it if you like. Jesus told this parable of the unforgiving servant to illustrate the point we've just been making, that since God has forgiven us, we should forgive others too. And indeed, the Bible is full of such commands to be forgiving. Now, as ever, it's important to note that the Bible doesn't explicitly say that forgiving will make us happier. That isn't the Bible's focus. The Bible tells us to forgive simply because it's the righteous thing to do. It's only in recent times that science is beginning to discover that if we do this righteous thing, if we are forgiving, we will indeed be happier. Joy will come forth. Now, does taking this righteous path of forgiveness involve discomfort, sacrifice, and discipline? Yes, it does. The righteous path always does. The hedonic theory would say to get satisfaction here and indulge in revenge, indulge in paying that person back for what they did. That would be the intuitive path. But as easy as that path would be, as easy as the hedonic path is, it will only lead to anxiety, depression, and health problems. We need to do the counterintuitive thing. We need to take the righteous path of forgiveness, because though it be more difficult, though it involve discomfort, sacrifice, and discipline, that's the one that leads to true joy. Once again, it's the theme of this whole series. Joy is simply a byproduct of righteousness. Just two more quick things before we finish. I understand I'm packing a lot in here, but just two more quick things. Firstly, if someone forgives you repeatedly, don't mistake it as a sign of them being weak. Don't think of them as being a pushover or a doormat. We may be tempted to think, oh, they just let me off every time, whatever I do, they're a pushover. No, Forgiveness isn't a sign of weakness. Forgiveness is a sign of strength. Anyone who forgives, remember, is absorbing painful debt. So if someone forgives you, don't take it for granted, and certainly don't try to take advantage of it. Them forgiving you is a form of everyday heroism, really. How easy would it have been for Carrier Colin and MacDonald to harbour bitterness or to try to get revenge on their attackers? It would have been so easy, it would have been so natural. It would have required no strength at all. The true strength that they showed was in forgiving. And anyone who forgives you, anyone who forgives me, does the same thing. They're showing strength. Those people are heroes. We should admire them and be thankful for their strength. Secondly, forgiveness isn't pretending that something didn't happen, or pretending it didn't hurt, or pretending that it didn't matter. Forgiveness isn't condoning the actions of the perpetrator either. Forgiveness is about acknowledging that something happened, that it hurt, that it mattered, but that you're not going to let it embitter you. You're not going to let it imprison you. You're not going to let it steal your joy or your health or your relationship with God. That's what forgiveness really is. Okay, I'm done. As always, put this to the test. Don't just hear about forgiveness and then walk away and forget and do nothing. The blessing only comes to those who obey. If you have someone in your life that you're holding a grudge against, then take steps to forgive them today. Make contact with whoever you're estranged from and forgive them. Next time someone hurts you, be less quick to lash out and try to get revenge. Instead, be quick to forgive them. Try to empathize with people. And remember that God's forgiven you, so try to show that same grace to the people around you. Release the bitterness so that it doesn't fester in your heart and take root in your life. Even love your enemies. The Bible's been saying all of this for thousands of years, but now science is backing it up, that if we practice a lifestyle of forgiveness, we're going to be a whole lot happier.